On a humid August night, Davian sat alone on his porch, sipping a beer as a soft breeze drifted through the empty street. The quiet was comforting. His roommate Jace had gone out, leaving him with the house to himself for the night. He liked the solitude, the rare moments where he could just sit back, enjoy the evening, and let his thoughts wander. It was nearly midnight, and aside from a few rustling leaves and the occasional chirp of a distant cricket, everything was still. Davian took a long sip from his beer, savoring the coolness, and looked up to the sky, wondering if it would rain. Then a figure appeared at the far end of the street. At first, Davian thought it was just someone walking home from a late shift, or maybe a neighbor heading out for a midnight stroll. But as the person drew nearer, Davian noticed something off. The stranger's movements were odd, almost robotic. His shoulders were unnaturally rigid, and he barely moved his arms as he walked. His gait was slow but deliberate, like he had somewhere specific to be. Davian felt a shiver creep up his spine, a feeling that he couldn't shake. The man continued his eerie march down the road, his blank gaze fixed forward. Davian leaned forward in his chair, unable to tear his eyes away. The stranger's face came into view as he stepped beneath a street lamp. A pale face, nearly expressionless, with eyes that seemed to look through everything, unfocused yet oddly intense. Then he stopped, right in front of Davian's driveway. For a heartbeat, they both stayed still. Davian's hand tightened around his beer bottle, his pulse quickening. The man simply stood there, staring straight ahead as though lost in thought, or perhaps waiting for something. The porch light cast a faint glow on Davian, and he wondered if the stranger could see him. Then, without warning, the man took a step forward and began walking up the driveway. Panic surged through Davian. He bolted up from his chair, spilling his beer as he stumbled back toward the front door. His mind raced, adrenaline drowning out any clear thoughts. Fumbling for his keys, he managed to unlock the door and slip inside, quickly turning the deadbolt behind him. Heart pounding, he pressed his ear to the door, listening for footsteps. He didn't have to listen long. A quiet but steady sound echoed from the driveway, the scrape of shoes against concrete. Davian's mouth went dry as he watched through the peephole, his breath shallow, trying not to make a sound. The stranger was at his front step now, his eyes colder and more distant than before. In his hand, he held something. A metallic object, long and glinting in the porch light. Davian squinted, trying to make it out. A crowbar? A hammer? The man's fingers clenched around it, and a chill ran through Davian's veins. Suddenly, the man lifted the object and began to fiddle with the doorknob, testing its strength. The door rattled slightly, and Davian's heart hammered against his ribcage. He backed away, eyes darting around the room, searching for anything he could use as a weapon. His phone lay on the table nearby, and with shaky hands, he dialed 911. The operator's voice was calm, asking him questions he could barely answer through his growing terror. He whispered urgently, telling her about the stranger on his doorstep, describing the bizarre and unsettling way the man had walked, the glint of metal in his hand, his lifeless eyes. The operator assured him that help was on the way, but every second felt like an eternity. He heard a loud, resonant thud as the man began to strike the door with the tool in his hand. Each hit reverberated through the house, shaking the walls and echoing in Davian's mind. He pressed himself against the wall, trying to silence his own rapid breathing. He could practically feel the weight of each blow, knowing it was only a matter of time before the door gave in. Suddenly, the front door burst open. The stranger stumbled inside, his face blank and emotionless, as though possessed. Davian ducked behind the staircase, barely daring to breathe as the man stepped into the hallway. The stranger's movements were slow and stiff, but his grip on the crowbar was unyielding, his blank stare scanning the dimly lit room. Davian held his breath, praying the man wouldn't come any closer. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the faint creak of the floorboards under the intruder's feet. And then, out of the darkness, The flash of red and blue light seeped through the window. Relief flooded Davion's veins as he heard the sirens grow louder. He dared to peek around the corner, just as the police officers burst into the house. The officers quickly restrained the man, who offered no resistance. Up close, Davion could see the glassy glaze in his eyes, the vacant look that felt so deeply unsettling. The officers spoke to the man, but he simply stared ahead, his mouth slack, muttering incoherently. No one could make out what he was saying, and he seemed completely unresponsive to their questions, as though he were in a trance. Later, when the officers escorted the man to the patrol car, Davion caught a final glimpse of his face through the window. For just a split second, their eyes met, and in the stranger's empty gaze, he thought he saw a flicker of something dark, something unfathomable lurking beneath. He would never forget that blank stare, nor the chilling realization that there was no reason, no logic behind the man's actions. Just emptiness, like the mind of something hollow, driven by an impulse that no one would ever understand. Renan's sister, Kasara, was rarely home. She was always traveling for work, leaving him alone in their two-story house more nights than not. He liked the quiet, but never quite got used to the feeling of being alone, especially at night. The house itself was old, with creaky floors and a strange layout where, no matter where you were downstairs, you could glimpse the dark shadows of the upstairs hall if you looked up. Still, Renan managed to keep his nerves in check, even when the silence felt thick around him. One night, he decided to indulge in a horror movie marathon. He laughed at himself as he dimmed the lights, saying out loud, "Come on, Renan, it's just a movie. Don't be a wimp." He settled into the couch, surrounded by the darkness of the open layout living area, the screen flickering ominously against the dim walls. As the movie unfolded with eerie shadows and unsettling sounds, Renan felt that prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the one that whispers, "You're not alone." He tried to ignore it, attributing it to the movie. But every so often, he glanced over his shoulder, scanning the space behind him where the kitchen and hallway melded into the inky dark. Each time, he found nothing but emptiness, yet he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After hours of tension, he finally turned off the TV, laughing nervously at his paranoia. He locked the doors, checked the windows, and went upstairs to his room, exhausted but still on edge. He lay in bed, eyes wandering across the ceiling, trying to ignore the quiet creaks of the house settling. Eventually, his mind surrendered, and he slipped into a fitful sleep. But around 1 a.m., Renan's eyes shot open. He lay there, heart hammering, unable to pinpoint what had woken him. For a few seconds, he listened to the silence, only broken by his own breathing. Just as he started to drift back to sleep, he heard it, a voice, soft and familiar, calling his name. "Renan." It was Kasara's voice, faint but unmistakable. He bolted upright, confused and hopeful. She must have come home late, he thought, though he hadn't heard the front door or any footsteps on the stairs. But her voice sounded off, somehow, as though it was both distant and close at the same time. "Kasara?" he called out, his voice trembling. No answer. He got up, heart pounding, and opened his bedroom door. The hallway was dark, silent. He stood there, straining his ears, and then he heard it again, a bit louder this time, as if coming from directly below him. "Renan, come downstairs." A chill rippled down his spine. Something about her voice seemed wrong, too slow, too drawn out. "She's just messing with you," he told himself, trying to shake off the dread crawling through his veins. He began his descent, each step creaking loudly in the silence. When he reached the bottom of the stairs, the house was cloaked in darkness. The air felt colder, as if the warmth had been siphoned out. "Kasara?" he called out, his voice cracking. Only silence greeted him. He flipped on the lights, searching the empty rooms one by one. The living room, the kitchen, even the guest bathroom. Empty. The house seemed larger, as though the walls were stretching, amplifying the emptiness. But as he stood there, still gripping the light switch, he heard his name again. This time, the voice was coming from upstairs. Renan. Panic bubbled inside him and his stomach twisted. He knew his sister wasn't home. He'd checked everywhere. But that voice, it was hers. It had to be. Right? His legs felt leaden, but he couldn't help himself. He slowly climbed the stairs, each step echoing louder than the last. When he reached the top, he froze. His bedroom door was now ajar, though he knew he'd closed it. Inside, the room was pitch black, but he could feel a presence. Something waiting. The darkness seemed to breathe, to pulse, as though alive. Just as he was about to step back, he heard it again, this time a whisper right by his ear. Renan, I'm home. He stumbled back, heart racing, as a shadow moved in the doorway. It was barely visible, just a sliver of something humanoid yet wrong, its shape distorted and twisted. It almost looked like his sister, her frame, her long hair. But its eyes were hollow, voids of darkness. In blind terror, he turned and ran, barely registering the stairs as he bolted down them, flinging open the front door and stumbling out into the cold night air. He kept running, only stopping once he reached the edge of their property. When he finally looked back, the house loomed silently in the dark, all the lights off again. He stood there, heart thundering, breath visible in the chilly air. He fumbled for his phone, dialing his sister's number with shaking fingers. After a few rings, she answered, her voice groggy. Renan? Why are you calling me so late? He swallowed, his throat dry. Kasara? Are you home? No, she replied, sounding confused. I'm still 2 states away. I won't be back for a few days. Why? What happened? Renan didn't answer. He only stared at the house, his mind reeling, wondering who or what had been calling his name in the dark. When I was 14, my parents decided to let me stay home alone for the first time. I was thrilled, looking forward to a night of TV, snacks, and maybe a late bedtime. They left after dinner, telling me they'd be back by midnight, reminding me to lock all the doors and not answer the door for anyone. I followed their instructions, locking everything and turning on the outside lights. The house felt different without them there. Every corner darker, every creak louder. After hours of movies and snacks, I was getting sleepy and decided to turn in. But as I shut off the TV, I heard something strange. It was faint at first, like a low scraping noise from outside. I stopped, my heart picking up its pace. The sound became clearer. A slow, dragging noise, as if someone was moving a chair across the wooden deck right outside my bedroom window. I hesitated, trying to brush it off. Maybe it was the wind, or maybe a loose branch scraping against the deck. But curiosity got the better of me. I crept to my window, lifting a corner of the curtain, just enough to peek through without being seen. A man stood on the deck, one hand on the chair, the other pressed flat against the glass. He was staring directly at my window, his eyes wide and expressionless, as though he had been waiting for me to look out. My heart nearly stopped. His face was pale, ghostly under the faint light, with unkempt hair hanging over hollow cheeks. He didn't look like anyone I'd seen in the neighborhood, and he certainly wasn't a friend. I knew everyone around here. This man, he didn't belong. My body froze, every muscle locked in terror. I felt like if I moved, he'd somehow know, that he'd sense it, and I didn't even want to think about what he might do. I backed away from the window, inch by inch, barely breathing. The silence stretched, making every second heavier, but then, like a crack of thunder, I heard him rattle the door handle. The sound jolted me, and I stumbled backward, almost tripping over my own feet. I wanted to scream, to call someone, but my phone was still on the living room couch, and getting to it meant passing by the glass doors where he stood. Then, the rattling stopped. For a second, I thought he'd gone, that maybe he was giving up. But as I strained my ears, I heard footsteps moving toward the front of the house. He was trying the other door. I rushed to the hallway closet, wedging myself in between winter coats and boxes of Christmas decorations. My heart pounded, so loud I was sure he'd hear it through the walls. I heard the front door knob twist, then a slow metallic scrape as he ran his fingers along the frame, tapping lightly, as if he was testing every weak spot, looking for a way inside. I was choking on panic, biting down on my sleeve to stop myself from making any sound. Every time he moved to a new door or window, I felt my skin crawl, knowing he was still there, relentless in his pursuit. Who was he? Why was he here? The man's footsteps circled the house again, back to the deck. He began banging softly against the glass, not with anger, but with a calculated patience, like he knew exactly how to keep me on edge. The glass shuddered with each hit, and I could almost imagine it splintering, giving way under his persistence. I braced myself, ready to bolt if he got in. Then, silence. The banging stopped abruptly. Minutes dragged by, stretching endlessly. I didn't dare move. I stayed in that closet, barely breathing, waiting, every sound amplified by my fear. Just when I thought he might have left, I heard a soft whisper barely audible through the walls. "Come out." My blood ran cold. He knew I was inside, hiding, and he wanted me to know that he knew. I stayed as still as a statue, waiting, hoping he'd grow bored, that he'd decide I wasn't worth the trouble. Finally, after what felt like hours, I heard his footsteps retreat. I stayed there, trembling, until I heard the familiar sound of my parents' car pulling into the driveway. Only then did I crawl out, stumbling to the door, choking back tears as I greeted them, acting like nothing had happened. They'd never believe me anyway. It sounded too much like a bad dream. But that night, and many nights after, I kept replaying the way he'd whispered through the walls, the way his eyes had bored into me from the deck. And though he was gone, the fear he left behind stayed, lurking just outside every window, lingering in every shadow. I never felt alone in that house again, not even when I was. Larkin's parents had rushed out hours ago, their hurried footsteps echoing in his ears long after they'd gone. His older brother, Cale, had been injured badly in a skateboarding accident, and his parents needed to be at the hospital with him. They told Larkin to lock the doors, keep the lights low, and wait patiently until they returned. He nodded, trying to appear brave, though his heart thumped against his ribs. Alone in the silent house, Larkin knew he had to keep himself occupied to fend off the creeping anxiety clawing at him. He booted up his game console, letting the familiar sights and sounds immerse him. For a while, he almost forgot he was alone. He was just about to beat his high score when he heard it. The distinct creak of the front door opening, followed by soft footsteps against the wooden floor. Larkin's first thought was that his parents and Cale had returned early, but then he froze. There were no voices, no familiar shuffle of his mom or dad's shoes, no reassuring call of, "We're back." Just a strange, hollow silence that filled the house and felt wrong. The air suddenly felt colder, and his grip on the controller slackened. He slowly put the controller down and moved towards the edge of the hallway, peeking out just enough to catch a glimpse of the living room. That's when he saw them. 3 shadowy figures, adults, standing silently in the dim light, their faces half hidden by darkness. They weren't moving, only standing, and that terrified him more than anything. These weren't his parents. These were strangers, and they were in his house. Paralyzed with fear, Larkin forced himself to take a step back, then another, until he was back in his room. He shut the door as quietly as he could and darted into his closet, burying himself under a pile of clothes and pulling the door to just a crack. His breaths came shallow and rapid, and he fought to keep from trembling. He told himself that maybe they wouldn't come upstairs, that maybe they'd just leave with whatever they'd come for. But a faint creak at the bottom of the stairs shattered that hope. His stomach clenched as he heard the first step groan, then the next. The strangers were coming upstairs, their slow, deliberate footsteps echoing like a countdown. He felt tears prick his eyes, but he pressed his hand over his mouth, holding his breath to keep from making a sound. Each step felt louder than the last, pounding like a drumbeat in his head. The footsteps stopped outside his room. Larkin's heart was pounding so loudly he was sure they'd hear it. Then, the door handle turned slowly, and his door swung open with a faint creak. From his hiding spot, he could see a pair of boots step into the room, scuffing the floor with every step. The figure, now just a shadow through the crack in the closet door, moved further in, scanning the room. Larkin bit down on his lip, willing himself to remain silent, to become invisible. The figure stepped closer. Larkin could smell something sharp, metallic, a mixture of sweat and something that reminded him faintly of rust. The man's hand brushed over Larkin's desk, knocking over a pen, which rolled noisily across the floor. The man froze, tilting his head as if he were listening, and Larkin could feel his pulse in his throat, begging him to breathe, to scream, to do anything but sit there in suffocating silence. Minutes ticked by, though they felt like hours. The figure finally moved away, but not before dragging his hand over Larkin's bed, leaving an unsettling sense of violation in the wake of his touch. Larkin watched as the man left, each heavy footstep resounding down the stairs, then the muted sound of their rummaging resumed. Time stretched endlessly until finally, Larkin heard the front door creak again, signaling their exit. He stayed in the closet, unmoving for what felt like forever, replaying every terrifying moment in his head. He imagined the what-ifs, each one worse than the last. What if he'd made a sound? What if he'd been found? What if they hadn't been there just to steal? After an eternity, he crept out, his legs shaking as he crossed the room. The house was empty, but it no longer felt like his home. The quiet had turned sinister, each shadow bearing traces of their presence, as if they'd left something of themselves behind. Larkin checked the clock. Only 2 hours had passed, though it felt like a lifetime. When his parents finally returned later that night, Larkin was sitting on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the wall. He didn't even react as his mother hugged him, his father asking in soft, worried tones if he was all right. He only nodded numbly, his mind still trapped in the closet, under a pile of clothes, breathing shallowly to avoid being detected. And though they never returned, the memory of those intruders haunted him in every creak, every whisper of the darkened house at night. The fear became a part of him, lurking in the shadows of his mind, reminding him constantly that sometimes it's not the things that go bump in the night that terrify us the most. It's the things that stand silently, watching. On a quiet evening, Eli was shooting hoops alone in his driveway. The sky had darkened into a deep, velvety purple, and the only sounds were the rhythmic bounce of the basketball and the soft rustle of leaves. He enjoyed these solitary moments, finding peace in the rhythm of the game. Just as he went to retrieve the ball after a particularly wild shot, a chill ran down his spine. Something compelled him to glance up at his house. In the window of the spare bedroom, he saw her, a woman he'd never seen before, standing perfectly still, eyes locked onto him from the darkness of the upstairs room. Her face was partially hidden by the shadows, but he could feel her gaze drilling into him, cold and unsettling. Eli's throat tightened, his mind racing to make sense of what he was seeing. He lived alone. How could someone be inside? Frozen, he held her gaze for several seconds, feeling his heart thudding in his chest. Then, as if jolted awake, he snapped out of his trance and bolted toward the front door. He flung it open, the adrenaline urging him forward. Inside, the house was silent, almost too silent, amplifying every creak and whisper as he moved. Room by room, he searched. The spare bedroom where he'd seen her was empty, the air stale and untouched. He checked the closets, the bathroom, under the bed, and even the attic. Nothing. Yet the hairs on the back of his neck refused to settle. That sense of being watched lingered, an invisible weight pressing down on him. Hours later, Eli finally collapsed into bed, exhausted but too unnerved to close his eyes completely. He lay there, staring into the darkness, trying to rationalize what he'd seen. Perhaps it had been a trick of the light, an overactive imagination. Just as he was beginning to drift into a fragile sleep, he heard it. A faint rustling sound, almost imperceptible, coming from the floor beside his bed. He held his breath, every muscle in his body tensing as he listened. The noise grew louder, closer, like something or someone shifting slowly on the hardwood floor. With a sudden, dreadful realization, Eli turned his head. There she was, emerging from the shadows beneath his bed. Her body contorted, limbs bending in unnatural ways as she dragged herself out inch by inch. Her eyes were wide, locked onto him, and there was something twisted in her expression, a mixture of fear, desperation, and something darker, something that made his skin crawl. Eli scrambled backward, pressing himself against the headboard, his voice caught in his throat as he tried to scream. The woman continued to crawl toward him, her movements eerily slow and deliberate, as if she enjoyed his terror. Her hand reached out, fingers trembling, reaching for his leg. In a surge of adrenaline-fueled courage, Eli leapt from the bed, his mind racing for an escape. He dashed out of the room, tearing down the hallway and nearly tripping over his own feet. He ran outside, banging on his neighbor Cale's door, shouting until Cale opened it, alarmed and half awake. Between gasping breaths, Eli explained, though his words came out jumbled and panicked. Cale didn't waste a second. The two of them returned to Eli's house, and together they cautiously entered his room, Cale armed with a baseball bat. There she was again, standing at the foot of Eli's bed, her posture rigid, her head cocked to the side in an unnatural angle. Her eyes flickered between Eli and Kyle, a strange smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. "Please, don't hurt me," she whispered, her voice soft and eerie, yet dripping with something insidious. Eli and Kyle approached carefully, Kyle holding the bat tightly. The woman took a step back, then another, as if realizing she was cornered. With a swift movement, Kyle grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door while Eli called the police, hands trembling as he dialed. When the police arrived, the woman was finally restrained and escorted from the house, her gaze never leaving Eli's. She muttered to herself, a mix of incoherent words and chilling, guttural sounds that seemed to linger in the air long after she was gone. The officers later informed Eli that she had a history of erratic behavior, often appearing in people's homes, seemingly unaware of her actions. They left Eli with a few reassurances, but no words could ease the image etched into his mind. The woman's face staring up at him from the darkness, her body slowly emerging from under his bed. Even after everything was over, Eli couldn't shake the sense that she was still there, lurking in the shadows, watching. That night, and every night after, sleep became a battle. Every creak of the floorboards, every whisper of the wind, brought back memories of her face, those haunting eyes watching him from his own home. A nightmare turned reality.